We always say we all need to have a plan. As I said, when the international financial architecture changes, it becomes more in unison on with the demands of the climate vulnerable countries. What we need to have are solid long-term national investment strategies. We don't want this climate prosperity plan to collect dust. We want it to collect checks. The cost of capital is so high that the moment our countries start to have these loans come in, which is a big problem, we get into this cycle of climate debt trap. In the case of Pakistan, 50-60% of our revenue that's generated is going in interest payments and principal payments. We have these great strategies, but who's going to implement them? That gives me a lot of hope.
Welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. The V20 group represents some of the countries most vulnerable to climate change despite contributing the least to global emissions. At a time when climate disasters, economic pressures, and questions around climate finance are becoming increasingly urgent, the voices of vulnerable nations are playing a critical role in shaping global climate conversations. Today, we'll be discussing climate finance, adaptation, climate prosperity, and what the future of climate action looks like for countries like Pakistan and the wider South Asian region. We are joined today by Hamza Ali Haroon, the Regional Director for South Asia Climate Vulnerable Forum and Vulnerable 20 Group. Hello, Hamza. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Mahin. Thank you so much for having me.
So, for viewers who may not be familiar with it, could you tell us what the V20 group is and what role it plays in global climate discussions and which countries are a part of this coalition?
Great. Well, first of all, Mai, thank you so much for inviting me to your show. My name is Hamza Haroon. I'm the Regional Director for South and West Asia for V20. V20, CVF V20 is a independent intergovernmental organization of 74 countries. Collectively, you can call them the Global South. So we basically represent the Global South voices of the entire nations. And as you know, Global South is the region that has been most impacted by the planetary instability caused by climate change. CVF basically is a head of state level organization, and V20 is a group of finance ministers, and both of them combined become the CVF V20. Our work essentially revolves around two critical pillars. The first pillar is essentially how we represent the Global South, the CVF V20, when it comes to international financial architecture. What we found in the secretariat of the CVFV20 is that a lot of problems that our countries face, which is debt, sustainability, which is providing money for their own people, which is having the fiscal space for development, stems from international financial architecture, which does not work to benefit or to strengthen these countries. So that is the first pillar that the V20 countries work on, basically trying to make sure that the voices of the global south are heard in forums like the UNGA, World Bank Springs annual meetings, in China, in all these other places, in FIX, and at COPs and UNFCCC meetings, so that the voices are heard and changes are made in the international financial architecture system that then helps these countries rather than continuously put them in the climate debt cycle that we see in many countries. And I'll give you more examples as we go over in our conversation. The second part that the V20 works on is it works directly with the governments. One of the things that we see in the 74 countries that we look after is that a lot of these countries are saying the same thing, and even in the Pakistan context it's the same thing. We have this idea that if we continuously tell people that we are victims of climate change, things are going to change. That's not going to happen. The agenda needs to change. Now it needs to be a prosperity agenda, and the prosperity agenda entails, and what we work with the governments is essentially creating these climate prosperity plans, national investment strategies for these countries, so that when you go to these international forums, when you go meet bilateral donors, when you go meet investors, you have a plan that says, look, don't invest in me just because I'm vulnerable. Invest in me, in my country, because we have a prosperity agenda. We want your investments, and you will get the profits that you're getting anywhere else in the world, so that you are also, happy, and at the same time the development in our countries is taking place. So CVFE 20, all in all, works on these two pillars, represents the global south, stands on a climate prosperity agenda, and wants investments to be at the core of it, so that the development in our countries, in these 74 countries, takes place. And Pakistan is also a member of the CVFE 20.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for explaining this to us. And I think, like you mentioned, that, it has to change from the victimization agenda and it has to be the climate prosperity agenda. And what really
Absolutely.
makes the V20, particularly important, like you also mentioned, I would just like to reiterate, is that many of its member countries are already experiencing the harsh realities of climate change firsthand. So now when we talk a little bit about climate finance, it has been discussed for years at international forums. Yet many developing countries still struggle to access, sufficient funding. Why do you think there continues to be such a major gap between climate promises and climate delivery?
That's a brilliant question. And that's the question that we work on literally. Mahin, this year in April, we went to the World Bank spring meetings. In the World Bank, during this World Bank spring meetings, we have our finance ministers come, and we jointly, work out a communique which we release. In this particular communique, the 16th Ministerial Committee communique, we actually highlighted four reasons why climate finance is still not coming to the countries that it needs to. The first one is scale. The second one is cost. The third one is the fragmentation of these agencies that are supposedly supposed to help us. And the fourth is essentially fiscal space of our own countries. Let me talk to you about the first one. When it comes to scale, there's a research that the V20 organization has done. V20 also does a lot of research. So we actually research on how much climate finance has gone in different countries, what was the percentage of adaptation, mitigation, what kind of projects, what kind of sectors. What we realized is that for these 74 countries, what is needed every year is approximately $490 billion. So every year, these 74 countries need collectively 490 billions. What we then realize is that only 90 billion is coming into these countries. Now, within that 90 billion, there's a lot of expensive loans as well, right? So we're counting that as well. But that's a caveat that we also have to understand.
Yeah.
So there's a massive, massive gap when it comes to what is required and what is actually being delivered. The second, Mahin, is cost of capital. The cost of capital is so high that the moment our countries start to have these loans come in, which is a big problem, we get into this cycle of climate debt trap. Because when you have high interest payments, when you have high principal payments, you have to repay those, then you're left with smaller fiscal space. Another thing that is continues to happen in our countries is our vulnerable countries actually have a higher cost of capital, approximately 1.2% higher, which results in $62 billion in excess interest payments that are going out of our countries into developed countries. So now you have a scale issue, you have a cost of capital issue. Now, in Pakistan, I always say that we love to look at fairies that can come and give us grant money, and then we say, oh, great, we got $50 million, $100 million in grant money, which, by the way, generally is not the case. A lot of these headlines you see have an underlying, thing of interest that no one, investigates, or no one really tries to get to. So the third one is essentially all these entities that work for us are so fragmented that or you already have such little amounts of this money, and then it's very fragmented. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
GCF. So GCF has 46 entities in 30 of our 74 countries, right? So now look at this thing. There are only 46 entities for 30 countries. And out of that, essentially, if you pool this all together, 25% of GCF money is direct access, which means it's directly going to a entity which is working on a project. Where's the rest of the 75% going? It's going to third party folks. Now you have layers of these intermediaries which take
Yeah.
away money. And in the
I,
end, what the governments get are so little. So we need
yeah.
to change that. This is where I talked about the V20 international financial architecture reform, this is where it comes in. We work with these partners and we tell them straight up, look, this needs to change. And the fourth piece is fiscal space of our own countries. It's so limited. In the case of Pakistan, 50, 60% of our revenue that's generated is going in interest payments and principal payments. But that's not just the case of Pakistan. It's the case of, for example, 17 of our 74 countries are in high distress. These countries are spending more money on interest payments than they're doing on healthcare, on childcare, on education, on development, on flood resistance, on flood protection, on heat wave protection. So these are essentially the four issues that we face that we've written down in detail in the V20 communique. That needs to change. The credit rating agencies need to, the real default rate is actually lower than what they portray for our countries, which then causes the cost of capital to go up. So these are tweaks that need to happen in the international financial architecture system. And at the same time, Maheen, we need to be ready that when this system changes, which is changing at a very slow pace, no denial about that. But we need to be ready with our investment strategies, with our programmatic approach, with our delivery units, that even if whatever little we get, it is executed in a very efficient form, which delivers the results that our countries need to see. That is primarily, in a nutshell, that what the work we do with our countries as well. And these are the four reasons that are causing climate finance to be a pie in the sky topic for many.
Absolutely. And I think the intermediary part that you mentioned, that yes, most of the money actually, goes to the intermediaries. And that's where we lose a lot. And most of these intermediaries are actually foreign funded organizations or foreign funded donor companies. So, there's also a growing shift in the climate conversation from vulnerability toward, opportunity and growth. And there is increasing conversation about the idea of a climate prosperity plan. And you've also used these words in your previous answers also. So how can countries like Pakistan, really turn climate action into economic opportunity and sustainable development?
Yeah, brilliant question, Maheen. Look, for us, these are more than words now. Climate Prosperity Plan is essentially one of the flagship projects, initiatives of CVF 20. What we need to understand is, and this is something I say to every finance minister I meet, every climate minister I meet, and heads of state we meet. We always say, we all need to have a plan. As I said, when the international financial architecture changes, it becomes more in unison on with the demands of the climate vulnerable countries. What we need to have are solid long-term national investment strategies. We need to clearly identify what sectors have the most impact on our development and climate ambitions. We need to identify not just the projects, we need to identify the programs which have a lot of projects within them that will have the most impact for the country. So the climate prosperity plans are basically, we've done one for Pakistan as well. I don't know if you can see it, but we've done one for Pakistan, we've done one for Bhutan, we've done for Sri Lanka, we've done for Bangladesh. These are low carbon, long term economic transformation plans. So we give ambitions, we give programs, we give solid projects, and these are made for governments and investors alike. It has three pillars, the climate prosperity plans. The first pillar is a very strong macroeconomic analysis. So, what that model does, Maheen, is essentially it says, okay, if you continue to trend in a business as usual case, where are your growth trajectories? Where are your socioeconomic indicators? But the beauty of this model is it's a dynamic model. So it's not like in an Excel sheet, you go and you press one button and it only changes that particular function. It is interlinked, it is dynamic, it is systemic. which impacts a lot of other sectors that are, within your sphere of, the government, essentially. So for example, if you have high growth in your carbon, how is it going to have health impacts? How is it going to have, other impact? And then it combines all this and tells you different socioeconomic indicators. So we have done that for Pakistan, for example, and for other CPP countries as well, all the way up to 2050. But we've also added a layer of NDCs. We've also added a layer of CPP, which we call an ambitious path forward for the next 25, 30 years. So we've kind of given countries an idea of what is the gap between a CPP ambition, a business as usual ambition, and the NDC ambition. The second part is really honing of the climate prosperity plan is really honing in on the sectors. But a lot of organizations, they tend to stay in Islamabad, for example, and they try to compile these reports. That does not help anyone. The complexities of different provinces, of different cities is so much that you need to take that into account when you're making a national level program, a national level plan, especially a long term national investment strategy. What we've done differently is we've gone through all of the country and we've met people. We've met civil society, academia, private sector, Pakistan Fruits and Vegetable Authority, FPCCI, all these folks that are actually seeing the impact of climate change, they all have recommendations. We're trying to compile that together and say, look, these are the sectors, these are the kind of recommendations, these are policy changes that these organizations, that these governments, that the provincial governments, society, civil society wants to see. That's the second pillar of the climate prosperity plan. And the third pillar is how do we get there? This is the part that many of our reports that are sitting in these offices, you'll go to a government office, you'll see many of these reports sitting there, and they've been opened maybe once or twice, and then they're just decoration piece. We don't want this to be a decoration piece. We don't want this climate prosperity plan to collect dust. We want it to collect checks. And the way you make sure that it collects checks is that it has a list of projects, investable projects ready for investors to come and invest in. And that's how you close the circle. And the other thing that we've done is we've said that, look, this national investor book that we've created, I don't know if you guys can see it, it's
We
it's
can.
going to be it's going to be updated every 3 months. So the projects that have gone through the cycle of investments, they will go out, and the new projects that are coming in are going to be a part of it. And Maheen, the best part is it's not my organization's report. It's the Ministry of Finance, the government of Pakistan's report. If you go online on Ministry of Finance, you will find this report. That is the accountability and the ownership that is required by governments, and I'm so glad Pakistan has done that to go towards the climate prosperity pathway that these countries need to go to, following the prosperity agenda that CVFP 20 talks about. So that's all about the climate prosperity plans.
This is absolutely amazing. And, of course, like you mentioned, that, ambitious climate prosperity plans, they do require strong institutions and effective implementation. And I'm so glad to hear that, you had government departments that were at par and that were involved in this report. And this is extremely informative for our viewers as well, that they can actually check this report. What is it called? The Climate Prosperity Plan, right?
Climate prosperity plan, Pakistan climate prosperity plan.
Yes, so I think it's very
Yeah.
informative for everyone who wants to check it out online. They can check it out online as well. Thank you so much for this information. So we've often, hear terms like country platforms and delivery mechanisms in climate governance discussions. Could you explain what these mean and why they're becoming increasingly popular?
Again, a very pertinent question to the discussion that is happening. Look, we've created all these amazing plans. I've seen a couple of plans as well during my time working on this. The problem in our country is countries, for not just Pakistan, I think many countries, developing countries face this, is of implementation. We have these great strategies, but who's going to implement them? How is it going to implement it? How is it going to get implemented? That remains the biggest question. The first big factor that we see in these countries is fragmented approach. We have so many departments working on the same things, working in silos, and they're okay doing that. Well, we're not okay with that. And a lot of people in the government are not okay with that as well these days. A country platform is essentially a delivery unit of your national investment strategy, especially when it comes to climate positive programmatic approaches. What we've tried to do, and this is something we've learned through our consultations, not just in Pakistan, but across these countries that are CPP countries that have built these climate prosperity plans, is that you need a delivery unit that has a whole of society and a whole of a government approach. Because otherwise, we will continue to work in silos. This is not just a, in the climate world, Maheen, just going off script, we have this amazing ability to make these amazing jargons, and then no one understands them, and we continue to work on them. But with the country platforms, we've tried to simplify this. We've said, look, it's a delivery unit. You've created this climate prosperity plan. It has 69 projects. It's worth over $4.8 billion of projects. And also some areas where if you have the right grant or first sort of investments, seed investments, these can scale up to billions of dollars. So, why don't we bring this all together in one delivery unit? And the entire job of this delivery unit is to execute this. Now, what does that mean? That means pipeline development. That means transaction advisory. That means relationships, bilateral and multilateral, with vertical funds, with bilateral funds, with all these other philanthropies, and bringing it all together. What happens sometimes is, for example, let's say you want to solarize all the schools in Pakistan, right? And you find this one big philanthropy that agrees to do it, but it's never going to match the scale that is needed to execute such a project, right? So you need to bring in other projects. Now, what happens is sometimes one department is then stuck with this one partner and doesn't know that there's a universe out there of investors, of other folks that would be interested in this. So we're trying to bring this all together. And we're trying to say that, look, let's focus on programmatic projects so that people are interested, because a lot of these funds are going towards that. And would love to talk about the vulnerability to viability compact that the V20 is also working on. And these compacts and these funds want to see more programmatic approaches to these national plans, and that's why delivery unit is extremely important next step for many of our CPP countries, including Pakistan, which is going to deliver on the ambitions that we've set out for.
So, Hamza, you just mentioned the vulnerability to viability compact, while explaining country platforms and delivery mechanisms. So, could you please touch a little bit upon that? And could you please tell us what exactly V20 is doing in terms of that?
Absolutely. As I mentioned before, Mahin, we do a lot of work on reforming the international financing architecture for our countries. One of our leading partners in this vulnerability to viability compact is the OPEC Fund for International Development. And what we're working with them is essentially on four critical pillars. One is concessionality. Concessionality is essentially saying that, look, we can't afford high cost loans anymore. Many of our countries can't. So we need to figure out a framework where we have concessional lending for our countries. And we're having a group of partners within this compact, which are going to be a part of it, which are DFIs essentially. The second pillar that we're working on is how do we mobilize private capital to come into the CPP programmatic projects that we've outlined, right? So, for example, is there capital around that's sitting for renewable energy, that's sitting for water, that's sitting for education, that's sitting for healthcare reforms, or programmatic projects for health that can come into our V20 countries so that we can start seeing the on ground climate positive development that we look for. And the third is essentially, based on our previous conversation that we were having on country platform, how can we empower our own countries through country platforms, through delivery mechanisms, through delivery units, so that they can start working on these national ambitions and national strategies that they have. One of the points I used to make when I was running for elections is like, World Bank is not going to come and tell you how to fix the light bulb on your street. You can do that yourself. So, that's the kind of approach, now you think in country context, fly in, fly out consultant model is should be, I mean, I don't want to say that, but it should end. Fly in, fly out consultant model should end now. We have enough intelligent people in our countries who understand the priorities and the complexities and the problems of their societies, communities better than anyone. We need to empower them and we need to utilize them to then deliver our national priorities and commitments. And the last is the within the V2E compact is advancing shock responsiveness for our countries. Like debt clauses, catastrophe bonds, parametric insurance, and all these things. So we're discussing all this with our lead partner, OPEC Fund for International Development, and other DFIs, and inshallah we'll be signing the compact, the white paper, in June, on June 23rd, in Vienna, and that'll be a great start to the reform that we are wanting to see in the international financial architecture.
That sounds absolutely amazing, Hamza. And I think the vulnerability to viability compact is exactly what Pakistan needs. And the four pillars that you mentioned are sort of the core basics that, we need when it comes to climate change. And I think the pillar that really matters the most, like you mentioned, is empowering our people. Because unless until we don't do that, we cannot put up a battle or a fight against climate change. And we need to empower. And like you said, we have enough brilliant manpower. We have enough brilliant minds in this country to take that job. So Hamza, you've taken this role and you're looking after this region. I also read that you ran elections on climate agenda. So how do you bring these two things together?
It's a brilliant question, Mahin. Like all the other brilliant questions you've asked me today. Um, Look, for me, it's the same mission on different stages. The reason why I ran for elections was very simple. It was I was frustrated. I was frustrated that the climate agenda is put aside as a environmental agenda that we'll speak about later. It's always trivialized in our conversations, which then turn to law. Um, that frustration, one of the beauties of running an election is that you are then forced to listen in a way to people. For me, it was a privilege. It was a privilege to listen. When I went around all these areas within my constituency, and I met all these young folks, older folks, they talked about, in one way or the other, about climate change. Because climate is not a trivialized secondary issue. For many of us that are at the front lines now, it is a national security issue. It is an economic issue, which in then automatically becomes a national security issue. So, what I learned from those conversations, like, was indirectly people were speaking about climate change, talking about weather pattern changes, talking about cloud bursts, talking about their years, talking about all those other things that you link back to climate. So, when I go into this new role now, I now have a lived understanding of realities of people that are going through these difficult times because of climate impacts. And what it helps to do, Maheen, is when I'm in these negotiating rooms now, when I'm in these rooms where finance is being discussed, I've actually seen and talked through, had the privilege to listen to lived realities of people. So for me, it becomes very easy to bring in that passion that is needed and the voices that are needed to be echoed in those important rooms. I'm trying to bring this whole thing together, and that is a beautiful thing. I think it has really helped me bring the voices of, for example, I've sat at so many dhabas, to bring those conversations from the dhabas to a UNFCCC negotiating room and talking about how it is important that the opportunities through climate finance come to these cities, come to these communities, so they can sustainably go through in a resilient fashion towards their future. So that's how I bring these two worlds together, and I hope I can continue to do that because climate change is here to impact us in a lot of many different ways, and we must be ready for it through proper planning, through proper strategies and implementation and execution.
Absolutely, that actually sounds really, really amazing. And like you mentioned, that climate change and these problems, they could be trivialized before, but now the reality that we're living in, climate change is a really, really big threat that we cannot ignore. In fact, it's our reality. So,
Yeah, yeah,
like you mentioned, we
yeah.
need to have that passion. Everyone needs to have that passion to, fight climate change and to actually, come up with meaningful change. Um,
Just want to quickly add something. It comes down to 9 to 10% impact on GDP, for example, in the case of Pakistan, is astounding. I think Musaddiq Malik does a very good job in putting all these facts together. I was watching his speech in Baku, and he was talking about the missed school days, the GDP impact, the amount of people displaced, and he had a very good analogy, and that these amount of people were not even displayed in any of our wars. And the fact that it's happening because of climate. Of course, the national integrity and the other international issues are there, and they need to be dealt with, and they need to be dealt with swiftly. But we also need to be on war footing when it comes to climate impacts, because slow onset events, catastrophes, they continue to happen. We're going to face a surge of, in Pakistan and a lot of South Asian countries are going to face a surge of heat waves. Monsoon is coming up as well. So, and it's going to continue to happen. Not one day monsoon is not going to disappear from our, dictionaries. It's going to stay. So we need to be out there. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you, but I just wanted to add the context that 9 to 10% GDP impacts and the millions displaced. This is just different footing than what we have seen before, and we need to be very agile and resilient when it comes to our planning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for actually adding this, because this just brought more knowledge to everyone who's watching the show as well. So, do you believe that South Asia has the potential, to become a global leader in areas like renewable energy, green transport, and climate innovation over the next decade?
Absolutely. I believe we're already leaders, and I'll give you some examples. In Pakistan alone, we imported, and these are unofficial numbers. No one knows the official figures. We've imported over 17 gigawatt worth of solar panels. Now, let me zoom out a bit. We did a report with Ember. Ember is a very famous, energy analysis company. They do brilliant analysis when it comes to energy. We did a report together, and I would love your audience, love to tell your audience to request your audience to go and check that report out. One of the key things that we got out of it was that the V20 countries, when it comes to solar penetration, solar energy, and renewable energy, it has actually surpassed that of the capacity of the United States. So our countries have actually more capacity, already linked, than the United States, which is incredible. And electrotech, which is getting the renewable energies and electrolyzing, the entire ecosystem, the value chain, is something that the V20 is working on diligently. And I do believe South Asia has a huge potential. Africa has a huge potential when it comes to solar. Even though the numbers are saying something different when it comes to actual realities, but they have huge potential when it comes to solar energy. And I believe many of our countries need that, because a lot of things that are happening, for example, with data centers, with AI, will require a lot of energy consumption by our countries. And you can't exist if your energy prices, you can't stay on track and be at speed where the world is going if your energy prices are really high. So we need to go into a sphere where the energy costs are cut down, so we can not only provide affordable energy costs to our citizens, to our private sector, but also be at pace when it comes to artificial intelligence when it comes to data centers. So we can also continue moving in that sphere as well. So that is going to be a critical piece. And I believe South Asia is sitting geographically close to China, which is doing all this, which is the lead reason why a lot of our countries are importing renewable energy. And I believe V20 also believes that China is going to be the leader when it comes to leading the global south towards renewable energy.
Absolutely. And I think this is the kind of positive outlook, we need as well. And Pakistan and South Asia, is a land of opportunities and is a land of potential. So, of course, these things can happen in the future. And finally, I'd like to ask to sort of wrap up the conversation about the future of climate action. So, when you look at the future of global climate action, what gives you hope and what concerns you the most?
Young people give me a lot of hope. I'll be very honest with you. I meet some
Yeah.
amazing folks across our V20 countries and at UNFCCC negotiations. I think they are on the right track. But what also gives me hope is there's a trend towards this prosperity agenda. There's a trend towards creating national investment plans, such as the climate prosperity plans. There's a movement towards creating delivery units so that implementation is there. There's a movement towards, what the V20 is doing with the vulnerability to viability compact, bringing the DFIs together, bringing all these philanthropies together to get the concessionality right, to ensure that these implementation is led by the country, not by fly in, fly out models. There's shock responsiveness, and there's mobilization of private capital coming into these programmatic opportunities that these countries are coming up. So that gives me a lot of hope. What I still remain weary about is how slowly the international financial architecture reform is moving. And that is something that we must continue to advocate for, and find solutions and sit down with these DFIs, sit down with these MDBs, and figure out a way on how we can stop this consistent climate debt trap that the structure of these international financial MDBs and DFIs is causing our countries to stay in. So that is something that we need to continuously work on. But there's a lot of positives. The progress is slow. That needs to change. But I believe that we can make that happen. And the young people that I mentioned before are the ones that are actually going to, I believe, deliver on many of that.
So I'm going to take the positive and I'm going to take the hope part from your conversation. Like you mentioned, that yes, young people in Pakistan are the future, and young people will drive change, and they're already in the right direction. Thank you so much, Hamza, for this brilliant conversation. From climate finance and adaptation to climate prosperity and the role of vulnerable nations in shaping global climate policy, today's discussion highlighted just how critical these conversations have become, particularly for countries like Pakistan and others across South Asia that are already experiencing the impacts of climate change firsthand. It is increasingly clear that climate change is no longer only an environmental issue. It is deeply connected to economic stability, development, public health infrastructure, and the future resilience of nations around the world. And as global climate discussions continue to evolve, the perspectives and leadership of vulnerable countries will remain more important than ever. And thank you for tuning in to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm Mahin Azam Khan, and we'll see you next time.